Hey guys, thanks for taking a moment. We're recapping the fourth part of a series that I've been doing called A Prayer That Moves Heaven. And this week I want to talk to you about a few things. Number one, in 2 Chronicles chapter 20, verses 15 through 21, we find the climax, this epic moment when God disposes of or deposes of the enemy that's coming against Judah. And my first point this past Sunday was divine reconnaissance. That God knows exactly what the enemy is up to. If you look at verses 15 through 16 of chapter 20 in 2 Chronicles, you'll notice that the strategies of the enemy are not a mystery to God. Remember that. In fact, if you want to know what the enemy's up to, don't go chasing the enemy. Go ask God, because there's nothing hidden from God. God knows all things. There's no hidden lair where the enemy can, make up his little dastardly deeds and plans and like God doesn't know about it. No, of course, God knows exactly what the enemy's up to. Principle number 8 out of these 10 principles from the life of Jehoshaphat is this: ask God about Satan's plans before the enemy steals your most valued treasures. God didn't give Jehoshaphat 3 scenarios or a handful of possibilities or some maybe the enemy's doing this. No, he told Jehoshaphat exactly what the enemy would do and exactly where the enemy would show up. Listen, don't chase the enemy, chase God and ask God what is going on in your life and how the enemy may be strategically coming against you. Because there's no plans of the enemy that are a mystery to God. Number 2, we notice this idea of obedience to God rather than just sitting back and doing nothing and being passive. Obedience to God, active obedience to God. In verses 18 through 20, we notice that they got on their faces and they worshiped God. They thanked God that the prophet gave them a word of encouragement. The entire nation began to worship God with all their might. What an awesome day that would have been. What an amazing moment. Moms and dads and kids and grandpas and brothers and sisters, this group, this community, they fell on their faces and they worshiped God. Man, going to bed that night, have you ever been to an amazing worship experience and you go to bed and you're just uplifted and there's just the sound of worship ringing in your ears as you fall to sleep? It's an awesome time. But you know what? The morning comes, doesn't it? The next day dawned. And you can imagine being a warrior in Judah's army and you sling your legs over the edge of the bed and, yesterday was yesterday and it was good, but today is the day of battle. And you've got to go out and fight. Just like a Monday morning, you gotta head back into the fray. And as good as worship was, you still got to take action of obedience and step out in faith into your day. Set off that morning. Pastor Ron Mell in this little book called A Prayer That Moves Heaven says this. He said, here's a fact. Listen carefully. God functions in the midst of obedience. Satan functions in the midst of passivity. Did you catch that? God works in the midst of obedience. When we take that step of faith, remember that's what they had to do that. Moses had to stretch out his staff, but God parted the waters. Joshua, they had to march around. They had to physically do something. They had to act on their faith. They had to act in obedience. They marched around Jericho. It was God that caused the walls to fall down. It was Elisha that pursued the prophet and cried out and asked for a double portion, but it was God that gave the double portion. And there's illustrations all over the place in the Bible where men and women of God had to act out of obedience, and then God moved in the midst of the obedience. Powerful. Number 9 is resolve to do what God has asked you to do, to really do what he's asking you to do. Listen, you can memorize 10 principles, or you can memorize 100 verses. You can watch Christian programming. You can attend church services. But, if you don't do what you know, then it just stays up in your head. And, what good is that? You need to begin to practice obedience. Where's God nudging you? In your marriage, in your children's lives, if you have kids, with discipleship, with reading your word, with worship, with your personal health, with witnessing to your neighbor, or stepping into ministry. Is God nudging you and you've been passive? Listen, God often waits for us to put out the staff, to march around Jericho, to take that action of obedience. And in the midst of you doing what you know you need to do, God will begin to release a divine inflow of his purpose and open opportunities. How much of what you know have you begun to do? Number 3 is the music of obedience. I love this. 2 Chronicles 20:21. Jehoshaphat didn't put the power guys at the front of the battle, on the horses and the stallions and the studs, and they've got the shining, flashing swords and the warrior types of physical battle. You know what he put in front of the army was the worshipers of God. Those people that cried out to God, God, your mercies endure, your loving kindness endures forever. What a powerful truth that is. When you face difficult moments, and let's face it, we all none of us can see around the corner. And sometimes difficult moments come flooding into our life. Man, it is time to sing, God, your mercies endure. Your loving kindness endures forever. What a declaration of faith and truth. Listen, no matter what, no matter victory. See, they didn't know the end of the story like we know the end of the story, but they worshiped anyway. Victory or defeat, blue skies or torrential rains, health or illness, life or death, his mercies endure forever. God's mercies never run out. His love never runs out. His forgiveness never runs out. His compassion never runs out. Wow. They stood still. They took their position. They acted out of obedience and out of faith, and they began to worship God, and God begins to move in the supernatural. As their prayers and as their worship went up to heaven, I could just imagine the spiritual realm, those praises rushing to heaven, and in the opposite direction, the armies of God rushing down from heaven to invade the armies of the earth. Principle number 10 is lead the battle in worship. And this is exciting stuff. God sent out ambushes as they worshiped. God sent out ambushes and confused the enemy. Man, when you worship, the enemy gets confused, and he gets set back on his heels, and he turns on himself. What a powerful truth. And in the midst of that powerful truth, I want to give you a caution. And that is this. I think sometimes we can begin at the end of the story and just think, well, if I just break out in worship, then man, God's going to move. And you know what? He could. He could very well move. But I want you to take careful note of the progression of what happened in Jehoshaphat's life. Remember, he eradicated sin from the camp and sin from his own life. And he put all of his trust in God and his faith in God. And he believed in God. He saw past the circumstances into the truth of who God was. He spent time daily with God. And as he moved through this process, in the midst of this crisis, it wasn't until the very end, as he walked in obedience and faith, that God began to move. Now, again, God is sovereign and God is gracious, and often God will move on our behalf despite ourselves. But there's something to be learned about being a man and a woman of God who is in progress and who is daily on their knees, on your face before God, and walking in daily relationship with God. There's some power there. Well, I want to encourage you. I hope this series has been great for you to go through, and we've learned a lot about what moves heaven, what kind of prayers and what kind of heart attitude moves heaven. So this week, as you step out, as you sling your feet over the bed and you tackle life, would you lead in worship? In fact, lead with the music of worship and the music of obedience and the music of faith. And let me know how it goes. God bless.